Well, good afternoon, Father's House Church. I'm Gordon back with another episode of Beyond the Message, talking about the message from Sunday. I have Pastor Carrie joining me.
Hey, guys.
Welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Good to be back.
And it's good to have you back. And one of our speakers yesterday, Pastor Josh, as well.
Hello.
Great to have you.
Great to be here.
Also back. Talking about the second entry in the Bless Up series. Kind of the second and third, sort of. Josh, you kind of jumped in. We subbed you in for second service yesterday. Continuing to talk about giving and the importance of not just giving, really. I think more about the importance of understanding, our relationship with God, our call with God, and kind of how that obedience and things, how that manifests itself. But sort of centered around giving as the focus. Josh, how did it feel getting tossed up there on this? So I feel like we got to cover that here on the podcast.
Yeah, it was definitely different. I'd never done that before ever in my life. I mean, I did in Bible school. You had to do like they would make us do like spontaneous 5-minute messages. So they'd send you in the hall.
Really? Spontaneous?
Yeah, they wouldn't tell you it was going to happen in preaching class, and then they would be like, "All right, you have go prepare for 10 minutes or whatever," and then you.
Is that like a thing that happens in churches?
Apparently,
Pastor Pierre just comes around the corner message in 5 minutes.
It happened on Sunday, so
ready in season and out of season.
So, so it was actually, that was funny. The other funny thing that has happened is when I got here, when I started working here 7 years ago, we always do a fun staff initiation thing, and that was when I got here. It was when we started making new hires do spontaneous altar calls in the center of the office to staff. So I got 5 minutes to prepare for that as well. This one was definitely higher stakes than all of those.
I think you did a great job.
Mm-hmm.
But it was fun. It was cool. I've never preached off someone else's notes either. That was the other new thing. Yeah.
I have a question that I'm going to save for the end, but it's about that.
Okay.
Just letting you both know.
Okay.
We'll make a note of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then I guess let's get into the message. Like I was saying, just kind of talking about this idea of really which master are we serving, I think was really the crux of the message yesterday, and being able to differentiate that idea, where you put your focus, where you put your trust, that is what will be kind of your master, and how you can either control money or it can control you. I really thought it was a good continuation of the series, and it's nice to be able to talk about that freely. I think something that, we said this last week, but should be talked about. I'm glad it's being talked about, and especially in the way that we are kind of approaching it. And I don't know, what do you guys think, Carrie?
I think it is an extremely needed conversation. As a church, we started, I think last year, maybe 2 years ago, Pastor Pierre started talking about the difference between being a believer and a disciple. Mm-hmm. And discipleship is not just belief, but if it's belief and works, like Timothy talks about. It's putting our faith into practice. And this is such a crucial, both Josh and Pastor Pierre talked about how Jesus talked about money more than any other topic. So I think for us as a society, there's no way we can talk about following Jesus and not talk about money. Actually, I was going to save this question for the end, but I want to ask Josh it now. So obviously there was no preparation because Pastor Pierre got sick. It's, to me, seeing you preach second service, it absolutely felt like it was coming from within you.
Yeah.
And just because we're friends, I've seen you and Esther make a choice about how to live your life.
Yeah.
And I've seen that. And to me, it's why that message came so naturally. But I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I think there's, when it comes to preaching, so first of all, I like the science. I guess I'm going to give you a very roundabout answer before I get to my answer, but it's just how my mind went on Sunday. I really love the science of building a sermon and everything around it. because I feel like once you understand the science of it, it's very easy to just kind of like quickly piece together a sermon. But then there's like the art and the heart behind preaching and the spiritual side behind preaching, I think is what makes a sermon really come alive and impact lives. And that's when I was reading through his notes, it was like, man, like I've lived this, and it's truly not about money. It's about like what is controlling you. It just so happens that money is very easily a controlling thing because it dictates so much of our lives. And so, I just was like, well, I know the pieces I'm going to put into this as far as the sermon goes. I know exactly where he wants to land this thing. And I think I've got enough of my own story to make this work. Because it has so little to do with money and so much to do with like who's controlling you. That I think it made it easy for me to preach because like I said, I have no other option.
I have a more personal question.
Yeah.
So it is a heart issue, but I think because of the world we live in, and you talked about this a lot, and so did Pierre, it's extra difficult to surrender our finances and to trust God in that area. Can you talk about how did you and Esther as a family decide that you were going to live through the posture of trust?
Yeah.
Which is not your responsibility.
Yeah.
Like, how did you, like, what were the conversations you guys had?
Yeah. So when we first got married, it was great because sometimes when you talk about like money, you have no idea the financial status of the person you're speaking to. So sometimes you can talk and it feels like you're talking in a totally different world. But when we got married, I was support raising for my salary. That's literally where you, I'm going to say I don't recommend it, but I mean, if you're into that sort of thing, go for it, but I don't recommend it. The way I got my income, I was basically living as a missionary on college campuses. Like that's what I did. I ran young adult ministries. And anyway, I'd have to go and meet with people, basically give them my spiel on what I was doing. And would you be interested in giving us $100 a month? When you have to live that way, it's not a lucrative way to live. And so we didn't do it long because I'm not a great fundraiser and Esther was worse than me. So we decided early on that we had no option but to trust God that he was going to provide for us. So that helped. And then we have values that we were willing to, we budgeted to the penny. So we still do budget. And we would always, like, one of the things we always valued was relationships. And we felt like we would live generous lives when it came to relationships. So we'd break our budget for the sake of friendship, for the sake of building relationships, because we feel like good relationships honor God. And so if it was an area where it was going to honor God, we felt like, let's sacrifice here and be generous people. But it's pretty amazing when you live a life where you're like, we have no choice but to trust God. How often you can go back to the areas where God has provided for you. It's pretty amazing. And some people would call it coincidence, but when you've been praying for it and then like you see the stuff happen, it's like, sure, maybe it's a coincidence, but God clearly made the coincidence happen. So so pretty wild.
Yeah. And I think, you kind of touched on something there, Josh, that is something that I kind of wanted to bring up, which kind of gets back to your what you were sort of talking about at the beginning there, Carrie, and Pastor Pierre was talking about, like money is this one area where we kind of hesitate to trust God. And I don't necessarily think that's true. I just think that unless you're in the situation like Josh, you're talking about, because I think it's in the same way, right? He was talking about prisoners, where it's like when you're at that point where you have no other options, you can only go to God. And I think that's the issue with money, where a lot of people, it's not that they don't have money. Like the situation you were in, Josh, like we have no options. Like God has to provide. But it's the big problem is when it's like you can live comfortably, but it's, oh, well, I want a better house, or I want a better car, or I want a better this. And that kind of gets into the same sort of when we talk about spiritual, just that like life is comfortable enough, and I'm more worried about the extra stuff. And that's where we really lose that pressure to go to God.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what that was the sort of the thought I had. I don't know if you guys maybe agree with that or can talk to that, but I think Josh kind of based on that example, because I think everybody, I lost my job, I lost this, I don't know how I'm going to put food on the table tomorrow. I think everybody goes to God. You know what I mean? Like
totally. And I think Josh referenced that. I didn't see all of first service, but I know you referenced that in second service, that we actually live wealthier than the majority. So I'm making a huge generalization, but most of the people in the United States live wealthier than the majority of the people in the world. And you referenced that study about how people who make $250,000, like a certain, what was that amount or percentage?
250,000.
250,000. I just read that Sunday morning, actually. Which
That's
is funny.
crazy. And what was the percent that live paycheck to paycheck?
According to the study, a third of individuals making $250K a year live paycheck to paycheck, and that is mind blowing.
Yeah, that's
it
crazy.
really is mind blowing. But it's like lifestyle inflation is like a real thing.
Yeah,
and yeah,
yes.
Well, and sorry, not to cut you off,
fine.
but we were talking about this last week too. I don't remember where I read this, but they essentially asked people how much they would need to live comfortably, and it was people making $25,000 a year all the way up to $250,000, and they all doubled their salary.
that's
So it's just like it
Wow.
doesn't matter how much you're making.
Yeah,
You figure out how to spend all that money more often than not.
And I think that back to Josh's point, this is why it's all tied to values, because as someone who knows Josh and Esther, I can attest to the fact that their value is relationships. So they invest heavily in that area, not just with finances, but time, with, emotions. And that's an intentional choice that they made. And I think, I know Pierre said this first service, like what we value is where our money goes is what we value.
Yeah.
And it's evidence of a culture that doesn't understand contentment. And if you say you are a believer, if you are a Christ follower, but your money isn't going towards the restoration of the kingdom, be that through being an active participant in your local church, which is a whole other conversation, because otherwise you're consuming, you're not actually contributing to the ministry.
yeah,
Or through missions or supporting someone like a missionary or, whatever. It can be a ton of things. But if you look at, and this is why we use a budgeting app through EveryDollar, and it shows you like the percentage of categories.
Yeah.
So Josh and I, my husband Josh, every month we'll look at it and we'll say, okay, like are our percentages off?
Right.
Because maybe in a certain month we're going to value giving gifts to others more or whatever. But I think that very few of us actually look at where our money goes, and we would be shocked. We would be shocked. But I think so to circle back, that's one of the reasons why I think it's so hard in this current climate, because we actually have a ton of wealth, but we don't understand contentment.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
we spend it on a bunch of crap.
Yeah, that's true. And I think too, you talk about, well, this is also going to be a broad sweeping generalization, but you see the difference when it comes back to that core concept of, is the money a tool or is it controlling you? And you even think about people, the easiest example is like all of our great grandparents who grew up in the Great Depression, and then would drive the same car for 77 years and would, no matter how much money they got later, still lived so frugally.
Yeah.
And how that can also be a detriment when you don't have that mindset of, well, this is all God's to begin with. And so now that I have more, I shouldn't be afraid to lose it, because it's just now I have more to serve God with and do stuff with. It's not, I might lose it, and so I have to hold on to it. Now that's it controlling you.
Right.
And so there's a lot of different ways where, but again, this is why it's such a tough, much like everything that we talk about when it comes to Christ and following him, it is a tough kind of tension and tightrope to walk, where it is wise to have some savings. Don't throw your savings account away. Don't do all this. And I forget exactly how Pastor Pierre worded it, and we talked about this last week on the show too, the importance of making sure that it is your first fruits.
Yeah.
And it's the first amount, because when it's the last amount, you just feel that weight of it. And I think that kind of also shows who's in control. Because there might be some people here who you do tithe 10% or however much you tithe, but if it's the last thing you do, right, that also kind of shows where your heart really lies with it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You're just doing it to check it off the list. And, you know, I think we can kind of ask ourselves that question in every aspect of our life, every day, right? Today, what did you give your first fruits to? What got the best part of you and why?
Yeah.
And how does that affect, like you just said, Carrie, the percentages, right? So what percent did you give to where? And how does that affect the things that you gave those percent? Because you could still give 10%, even if you serve at church, right? You could give 10% of yourself. But if you're a greeter and you're grumpy because it's the last 10% you have of the day, that's bad. There is a difference in the same amount can be have a different implication and consequence.
Yeah.
And I think that comes back to what Josh was saying towards the end. I think it was towards the end where you really honed in on the fact that it is a heart issue.
Yeah.
And God ultimately is our provider. I was just thinking as you were talking, Gordon, I have a friend who her economic status changed very rapidly. And
You know the person who won the Powerball?
yeah. And she was going from paycheck to paycheck and was just so diligent in her work and took a lot of leaps of faith and is now making like a lot of money. And we were having a conversation recently about it because, we hadn't really talked about it. I don't like to pry into people's finances, obviously. But this conversation opened up and she was saying that she's really had to think about where she wants this money to go because she's single. She doesn't have any kids, and she didn't use this language, but culture is definitely saying one thing.
Yeah.
And I think what she's choosing to do wouldn't make sense to like the average person, but it makes total sense to her through her faith. And, Dave Ramsey says this all the time, like live like no one else now so you can live like, nobody else later. Well, she's in the later part. Yeah. And it was just fun to hear. And we started dreaming about, well, what do you think God wants you to do with this access? And of course she's saving and she's being diligent, all those things, but then still there's a large excess amount. And it was like a privilege for me to watch this conversation happen because she started having like God-sized dreams about how this blessing that God had provided for her could impact a lot of other people who maybe weren't expecting it, who never even would know it would come from her. So I think there's also that element of living a generous life. There's like our tithing, which is where we start, but there's this really cool other area where when we ask God, like, what do you want to do through my life? This is what's in my hands. Like very amazing things start to happen. Even Josh, think about like, okay, how many years ago were you a missionary, like selling a parking lot basically?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That was 10 years ago, I think, actually. Yeah, it was right when Esther and I got married. It was my first marriage job. I started before we got married, and then, I quickly, as quickly as possible, when I went on, anyway, I mean, it's kind of off topic, but I went on one fundraising call with Esther, and like the whole thing is, you say that, like, would you give us like $100 a month? And you're silent. And you let them do the mental wrestle. Because people don't want to just say no. So generally they'll be like, well, we can't do that, but we'll do this, blah, blah, blah. But you never say people's no's for them. And then I was like, get to it. And this family easily could have done $100 a month. I was like, would you give us $100 a month? And I just shut up. And without even like split second, I was like, but you can't just pray for us if you want. Like, and obviously they're like, yeah, we think that we're just like in this season, we're just going to pray for you guys. We left. I was like, you're never doing this with me again. But I quickly went, like that church ended up giving me a salary, which was kind of nice. So, I mean, it still wasn't, the thing is, like, I feel like for our story, it's not everybody's, but for our story, and part of me wishes it wasn't this way, to be honest with you, but we've had to have the like we need to trust God now thing. I think God knows that if I just had access to endless funds, it would not be a pretty thing for anybody. But we live in that space where no matter how much we have, we just always just trust that God's going to provide for us. And I feel like we never live a life where we are in want or need of anything. I feel like we've been able to have incredible experiences that really don't make sense. So, but it is a thing. Like, people, I think it's when you latch on to the things that culture says are important.
Yep.
And that you have to do.
Yeah.
That it can become debilitating. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I kind of have always felt that way too. Just like, for me, the thought is never like, what do other people say I should be having? It's just more, am I comfortable? Like, do I enjoy what I do?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, then I'm fine. Like, yeah. Like you said, Josh, I'd love to be able to afford just like, oh yeah, my family, we're flying first class around the world. Okay. Or whatever. It is. You know, I don't actually want to travel at all. My wife's going to be mad that I use that as an example, because that's a point of contention for us. You know, but it's like, okay, that'd be great, but that doesn't mean I don't enjoy what I have. And I think, you know, there is a lot to that, Josh. Like that's a big, like Jesus said, it's harder for a camel to go through the eye of the needle, because when you 9 out of 10 of us, 99 out of 100, whatever percentage, if given unlimited money, would just leave God immediately and would just be like, yeah, I'm all set now. This is because that's just the power I think that money more than anything else has over us. Yeah, is it very easily just controls us.
You know, the other part to this that I think is so interesting, especially now, like I do not remember a time like, well, maybe I shouldn't say that, but it's so common now to have like a bajillion side hustles. So it's like to really savor or enjoy something in life is quickly the conversation turns to how can I monetize this? And I'm doing this like deep dive study on the Sabbath. But part of God's commandment to remember and observe the Sabbath is, one, to remember how he brought the Israelites out of Egypt, that they're no longer slaves. But when the Sabbath is talked about again, I think in Deuteronomy, he expands upon it and he says, you are to rest, but so are your servants, your children, and your farm animals. And that part of the commandment was that they would not become slave owners. Right. Because that is God's upside down kingdom. We all actually enjoy in a life of contentment where we can rest. And I think that that's so important because now very few people really do take a Sabbath or have a day where they're not working, because it's like, well, I need to achieve this. I need to obtain this. This isn't good enough. It's like it never ends.
Yeah. Well, and on top of that, and we talked about this, I forget when we did our series on the Sabbath.
A couple of years ago, I think.
Well, okay. I don't know. Yeah, a long time ago. But the point is, that feels, wow, okay. You just hit me with like the passage of time, Carrie. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm old. And anyway, the point is, when we do rest, like you're not Sabbathing correctly. You know, you're resting by watching Netflix or watching TV or playing video games, you know, whatever you do. But like the Sabbath, the point of the rest was to reorient yourself to God. It's not about taking a nap.
Right.
You know, it's about reorienting yourself to God. And sure, if you can't maybe make a day of that, and I don't think we should, I think a modern Sabbath is a daily thing where we're always going back to God and resting in him and how that looks. But that's, I think, something that also gets lost. And it's so easy to, in that hustle of life, just totally discard God because your rest becomes this physical thing. And I think that's what's such a big, when you talk about money too, you know, I think more than any other topic, for whatever reason, when you get to the blessing part, right? Like God is going to bless you. People just assume that blessing is also monetary or physical. And I don't know why, because we talk about blessings in everything, but it just always feels like that's the assumption here, and that's not at all the point, right? And I guess that just again always comes back to how we treat it as this. That is the goal, and so therefore that is the blessing I want.
Yeah.
I think even that speaks to something that was said in the sermon that I wrote down. Whoever and wherever we place our source of security and happiness ultimately is our master. And if we're thinking of security and happiness could only come from our finances, then that's clear. Like, that is our master. And you use this analogy, Josh, I don't know if Pastor Pierre did just because I had to step out of the service, but about where is Jesus at our table? Is he just another seat at the table, or is he truly head of our household? Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a really amazing question. It like gave me pause about kind of every area of my life. Yeah. And, you know, my husband and I do these Sunday meetings where we'll just get together on a Sunday and we talk about like, okay, what's coming up in our week? We did this because we were fighting a lot because we weren't communicating. So I read this amazing podcast or this article that was like, no, okay, do these Sunday meetings. And that's where you kind of talk about like challenges for the week, what you need for each other. How can I be praying for you? And when you said that in the sermon, I was thinking like, how am I including Jesus in my Sunday meetings? You know what I mean? Like, am I really truly filtering those decisions through him first? Like, are Josh and I doing that as a couple, or is it like an afterthought? Yeah. Which I thought was a great question.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think the whole thing is, that's why it's like not all about money. It just so happens that money's got a very unique thing to it, because even Jesus spent a lot of his time attacking this idea that you have other things. That's why he said, hate your father and mother. You know what I mean? Yeah. He tells the one guy, the rich young ruler, like, sell everything you have and give it to the poor, then they can be my disciple. And he's the only one that's left Jesus. He's the only one that left Jesus looking for something that left disappointed. Because he just couldn't do it. And I think because the reality is, you know, it's either like, this is either crazy or it works. So I think when Jesus is saying things like hate your father and mother and leave everything you have and come follow me, I think you have to have some level of pause and be like, okay, if this guy's saying this, we should see if does it actually pan out well? And are people happier and more hopeful?
Okay, so even in that statement, does this work? Yeah. That's a complex thing to dissect, because you think of someone like Paul or all the disciples who were martyred. Yeah. Like, from the world's perspective, it didn't end well. Yes. You know what I mean?
Well, and I mean, even when they would say it worked, we would say it's not going well.
Yes.
Like when they're in prison and, you know, Paul's super happy when he's chained up in a prison, you know, and nobody would say that's it working, right? So even that question, like, you have to totally get rid of like your human expectations, because you likely will not get them.
Yes. Right. And even, I think this ties in so well with the end of the sermon where you talked about Jesus ushering in an upside down kingdom. That's why so many people didn't understand him. And how, as the disciples, I loved this part. You know, they're at the Last Supper. They don't understand the significance of it, but they're arguing about who's the greatest. Yeah. And then Jesus gets down and washes all their feet, including Judas, who he knew would betray him. Yeah. It's like literally the things that God calls us to will not make sense. Yeah. And that's okay. Yeah. Like, it's actually okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And then if you can't find like contentment with like the seemingly, like if you're in it, like the seemingly nothing that you have, like if you can't figure out a way to be content with what you have, like I don't think your contentment isn't attached to the things that you have. You know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
because if you don't understand the art and the value of contentment with what you have, which I really believe can only be found when you have a solid relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
Like, I think
That's what I was
the
going to
most
say.
pure
Like,
form of contentment.
God is what you have,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
the.
You can win the Powerball, and you're still going to have the same anxiety and anxiousness and, illogical feelings about your everyday life, because it isn't about the things.
Right.
It's about what's the ultimate source of your hope and security. And for the first century Jewish person, it was status and power and influence and control and political maneuvering, which is why they're having the argument, who's going to be the greatest?
Yeah.
Because
Well, I think it's everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, shout out to Solomon, right? Ecclesiastes again.
Yeah.
The whole point of that book is what you just said. Solomon's sitting there like, I have 1,000 wives and concubines, whatever.
Yeah.
All the money in the world.
Unhealthy.
I'm not saying it. I'm just saying, that is definitely some people's status, right?
For sure.
I have all the money you could ever count and more. I'm documented by God. Like, God shouts me out as the smartest man ever.
Yep.
Like the wisest person to ever live. And he still is sitting there writing like I'm still as empty. Like that whole, that whole inside is not filled even a little bit. So if that is what you think is going to fix you, it's not. And
really that's why this whole thing is about the practice of generosity, because it is interesting that God will generally have like a practice attached to one of the things that generally will make our heart sick. So like busyness, I do think that's why like Sabbath is a thing, because it forces a pause and a realignment and a rest. And in the same way, if you are consistently controlled by anxious thoughts around contentment, it is an amazing thing, and it doesn't make sense. It can seem illogical. But generosity, it just does something to you.
Yeah.
When you're choosing to give out of your discontentment and your anxiousness, it's actually amazing.
Well, and sorry, Carrie, you can go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that what I hear you both talking about is like you can give and be angry about it, and that's really not a testimony or a great witness,
right?
And you talked about the fruit of the Spirit in correlation with this act of living a generous life. And it reminded me of, I'm in Ecclesiastes. Yep. Thought of you, Gordon.
That is the book to read, guys.
And I was thinking of Ecclesiastes 9:9, which says, enjoy life with your wife, or your spouse whom you love, all the days of this meaningless life that God has given you under the sun, all your meaningless days, for this is your lot in life, and in your toilsome labor under the sun.
Yeah,
toilsome.
Amen. Solomon, thank you.
But I was thinking like he's saying like some of these, like, you think you have control, you don't.
Right.
But still enjoy your life. And then later he goes on to say, like, do what you're doing with your hands well.
Right. Yep.
Like, do it with excellence. So in the grand scheme of things, I think this is where being people of hope and people of true generosity, it comes from a different place.
Yeah.
Because we can be in the midst of not yet and be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's really hard. I mean, it's like not easy.
Right.
Yeah.
But
well, and that's, like Josh was talking about prioritizing relationship. Like, this is worth giving towards. And I think that is really what the whole example even Jesus led.
Yeah.
Nobody was more generous than Jesus.
No.
Yeah.
Right. And that was what he did. He didn't, sure, he preached and he gave messages, but so many of the stories are relationships that he had, how he walked with his disciples, how he, like the Martha, right? And Mary and Martha, like that story, Lazarus even. And he kind of leads that example. It's like, and that's what he wants with us. He wants relationship with us. And I think when we kind of understand that, we see it's like we have relationship with him. We understand that benefit. And then therefore we see the value in relationship with others, because it is all ultimately meaningless unless you see that like God is using it for his glory. And that is where the meaning comes from.
Yeah.
Not out of, all the money you have and all the things you have. And so, the heart behind it really matters, because if you have that good relationship with him, your heart will kind of lead you to act more like him.
Yes.
Yeah. Good
Cool.
good talk, guys.
Yeah,
It
this
was
is a
great.
good week. I'm
Yeah.
excited for next week.
Yeah, we're going to continue the series next week. Excited to see that. You guys have any final thoughts here as we kind of wrap up?
None from me.
I do think the only interesting thing, and I'm going to go over my own time here, so this is my fault. When this will be the last thing I say, and then I'm going to go.
All right, music ready.
When Jesus, the Last Supper, if there was ever a time where Jesus was going to be discontent, it is interesting that the one time he maybe experienced a little bit of discontent, he was alone praying to God, which I think is interesting, because he was sweating blood.
Mm-hmm.
That's anxiety.
Yeah.
But at the Last Supper, if that's me, my anxiety would be through the roof, and I would make sure that the strategy is heard.
Yes.
Like,
So
you guys
true.
need to understand, I'm leaving. They're going to arrest me. He's about to betray me. I will be arrested and I'm going to die. There's nothing you can do about it. I'm going to raise from the dead, but I'm going to leave again, and it's up to you guys. So remember the 2x2 thing. Go to different towns, shake your boots off. Like, that's going to be it. Plant churches. You're going to meet a guy named Paul. Like, lay it all out, full of anxiety. And instead of doing that, Jesus displayed true contentment, because in the moment where he should have been the most discontent, he was generous with himself. And I think that is so wild, because I would love to say that I would do that, but there's no shot.
No, not even.
No.
No
a bit.
shot. Like, he got up
Same.
and did something that nobody in the room would have done. And he did it. And basically that was the strategy he left them with.
Yeah.
Was, now that I've shown you how to do this, go and do it to others. It's freaking crazy.
But I think that's the perfect example, right? Because it, like you said, even if he told them, it wouldn't have made sense to them. And it's like, I think that's the perfect illustration of that. It's like, I could tell you, and it wouldn't change anything.
Yeah.
And I think we need to walk that same way. Like, I'm going to act the way God wants me to. And my friend who's not a Christian might say, you're insane.
Yeah.
But it's like,
Yep.
sorry, you just don't understand, and I'm not going to bring myself to that.
And your friend who's a Christian may still say,
and
you're
Christian's
insane.
right. Yeah,
Yeah,
of course.
exactly.
Of course.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying,
Yeah. Cool.
Well, all right, guys. That was great. Thanks for joining me here. And thank you for joining me in the chat, everybody. Always good to see you guys chatting. And we'll see you next week with more, Bless Up. That's the name of the series. I had a momentary blink. Prayer, as always, Wednesday night in the prayer chapel, 6 p.m. And youth on Fridays. And we'll see you on Sunday. Have a great week, church. Be blessed.